How is BPC-157 dosed, and what do people actually take it for? Today we're going to tackle both of those in detail. In part one, we covered how BPC-157 works, at least our best understanding of that. And today we're going to cover the clinical details that matter to you if you're taking BPC-157 or you're thinking about starting it. I'm Dr. Clete Barrick, founder of Barrick Health and board certified in internal medicine and obesity medicine. I make content focusing on GLP-1s, peptides, and longevity. I like to break the science down and bring it unfiltered to you. This is part two of the BPC-157 crash course. If you haven't watched the first video, I'd encourage you to do so because some of the background is critical to understanding parts of today's video. I'll link it above. BPC-157 is not approved by the FDA, nor is it approved as a drug anywhere in the world. Nothing here is a prescription and nothing here is medical advice for you specifically. Always talk with your doctor before changing your treatment plan. And if you don't have a doctor, hit me up at barrickhealth.com. We'll start top down. So here's my 30,000 foot overview. I think BPC-157 is reasonable and promising, but not well studied. If you're going to use it as a defined course with an end date in mind and get properly safety screened first. More on that later. Let's dive in. So first up is what people actually take BPC-157 for. Let's start on the FDA side of things. They evaluated BPC-157 for one indication and only one, ulcerative colitis, which is a painful inflammatory bowel condition. This isn't what most people take it for. So why UC? Well, because nomination for the compounding list is indication specific, and the two companies that nominated it for that. So ironically, the agency's entire efficacy assessment is about a condition almost nobody watching this video is taking it for. What the FDA found when it looked at what people actually use it for, gut and gastrointestinal uses are the most commonly mentioned and advertised on websites. The uses examined in the published literature are interstitial cystitis, knee pain, and ulcerative colitis. And the marketing language the agency collected covers mental, gut, cardiac, and autoimmune health, plus accelerated healing of injuries and wounds. And that's even including, gastric ulcers and then your tendons, ligaments, and bones. So let me rank the real uses, and I'm ranking them by how common they are, not by how good the evidence is. Number one by a wide margin is tendon, ligament, and muscle injury. That's what drives this entire market. Behind it, 35 preclinical studies. Number two is gut healing, gastritis, ulcers, damage from non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, NSAIDs like ibuprofen and naproxen, and leaky gut. Extensive rat data, no human data at all. Number three is joint pain and osteoarthritis. One chart review, 16 people, telephone follow-up, no validated outcome instrument. Fourth is interstitial cystitis and bladder pain with one uncontrolled pilot in 12 women. Then ulcerative colitis, which is the only indication with a randomized trial and the only one that the FDA looked at, like I said. Neuroprotection, traumatic brain injury, and spinal cord, which gets marketed heavily on rat data and, again, zero human data. And then post-surgical healing, cardiovascular use, and corneal and burn wounds, all rat and mouse only. Now put that next to the mechanism work that we did in part one of this series. The use that fits the pharmacology best is the gut barrier protection. That's where the rat data runs deepest. That's where the cytoprotection story started. And I think it's one place the whole thing holds together very well. Meanwhile, the entire market runs on tendons and ligaments. What about in my practice? Well, patients interested in trying BPC-157 are coming in with musculoskeletal issues, and this one isn't even close for me. The one thing I see that doesn't come up on usage searches is performance optimization. So people who are training hard, looking to avoid injuries. So how do people actually take it? We have to be careful here. and I want to be clear about this to the uninitiated. There is no established dose of BPC-157. No approved product means no approved dose. And a 2026 biopharmaceutical review states it quite plainly. There's no approved formulation, and nobody has validated a dosing regimen, and no phase 2 trials have ever been completed. So what we have is a set of clinical trial doses that differ substantially with the dosing regimens people are actually taking or talking about on Reddit and Discord and such. We'll start on the trial side of dosing. So we start with a rectal enema up to 2 milligrams per kilogram in one study and 80 milligrams a day in another. For intra-articular, so injected directly into the joint, that's 2 to 4 milligrams. Intravesical, that's into the bladder, 10 milligrams. Intravenous, 10 milligrams, and then 20. For a 75 kilogram adult, that's around 165 pounds. 2 milligrams per kilo is 150 milligrams. Every single published human exposure is in the milligram range. And note that none of those trial protocols are subcutaneous dosing. Next is what clinicians are actually doing. So 250 to 500 micrograms, that's micrograms, not milligrams, subcutaneous once a day, sometimes split morning and evening. Start at 250 for a week or two, go to 500 if you're not getting anywhere, 4 to 8 weeks for an acute injury, 8 to 12 for something more chronic. Let's think a bit more about that difference in dosing between trials and what I like to call functional dosing regimen. Functional dosing is 20 to 600 times lower than published study dosing. 8 weeks at 500 micrograms a day is 28 milligrams total. That's less than half of 180 milligram enema dose from the phase 2 trial. Now, I'm not giving you dosing recommendations here. This is educational content, not medical advice, but I am here to give you the real medical data. I consider that my job, and you deserve a proper analysis on this huge discordance. And remember, functional dosing is almost always subcutaneous, a delivery method that is completely untested from a clinical trial perspective. You can look at this one of two ways. Read one is that the clinic dose is conservative and sensible. Standard body surface area conversion of the dose is common in the rodent literature, give you a human equivalent around 120 to 2,500 micrograms for a 75 kilogram adult. And the clinic range sits right inside that band, towards the lower end. So that's real. Somebody actually did the math. It's just based on rodent trial data, not human data. Given the dearth of human trials, it's not unreasonable, but we also have to be honest that this regimen is rodent-based, not human-based. Read two is that the clinic dose could be subtherapeutic, and the reason clinics report broad benefit while the one adequately dosed randomized trial missed significance could be that neither one of them is measuring a real effect. I honestly can't resolve this from the information that's available, and I'm not going to pretend that I can. What I will tell you is this: if you're not responding at 500 micrograms a day by week 4, the idea that the dose was too low is interesting, but doesn't have real data backing it up. The bottom line is there is no real confidence in the current consensus dosing protocols, and anybody claiming that it is a well-validated dosing regimen doesn't really have anything to back up those claims. Caution is the operative word. Next, let's talk about oral dosing. There are two completely different reasons people swallow BPC-157, and it's important we keep them separate from the start. Reason one is directly targeting the lining of the gut. So gastritis, ulcers, damage from NSAIDs, leaky gut, inflammatory bowel disease. Reason 2 is everything else, targeting organ systems that sit beyond the digestive tract. So a tendon, a shoulder, a knee, etc. For those, BPC-157 has to get out of your gut and into your bloodstream. Those are not the same uses, and the evidence treats them very differently. So the whole rationale for oral BPC-157 rests on one property. It survives human gastric juice for over 24 hours. That traces back to a 95 digestion study, and the proline density at the front of the peptide gives it a plausible structural basis. That property is real, and it's unusual for a peptide. If your target is the lining of your gastrointestinal tract, you don't need absorption at all. A drug sitting in the lumen, meaning inside the tube itself, is already touching the tissue that you're aiming at. Surviving stomach acid is the big variable, so beat that and you're in a great spot. It doesn't need to go anywhere else. So what dose are we talking about there? Clinics run 500 to 1,500 micrograms a day, once or twice daily. That's 2 to 3 times what they use subcutaneously, and what's being sold lines up with it. The FDA cataloged the marketed compounded products and found 250 and 500 microgram capsules plus 500 microgram oral sprays. Now, how good is the evidence here? Better than anywhere else, but still not great. Gut is the one place where the route makes sense, the mechanism makes sense, and the rat data runs deepest. It's also the only indication that has ever had a randomized human trial. That was the trial on ulcerative colitis we've talked about previously, and it trended towards but missed significance. But that trial didn't use a capsule. It used a rectal enema at 80 milligrams a day, delivered from the other end into an inflamed colon. So even inside the one indication where oral makes quite a bit of sense, the human evidence doesn't cover the product you might actually buy and use. On to reason 2, which is the oral ingestion of BPC-157 targeting systemic effects. So that gastric survival property we just walked through is a claim about one barrier out of 2. So oral delivery of a peptide gets blocked in 2 separate places. First, there's the gastrointestinal environment. It's hostile to any complex molecule like a peptide. It's designed to start digestion of these substances after all, right? The intestinal lining or epithelial barrier is the next barrier that a molecule needs to cross to get into the circulation. So a 15 residue peptide carrying a net negative charge like BPC-157 has no obvious route across an intestinal epithelium. And when you search PubMed pairing BPC-157 with intestinal absorption or oral bioavailability, you get 0 records. In a phase 1 study, healthy volunteers got BPC-157 rectally at up to 2 milligrams per kilo. That's roughly 150 milligrams in an adult. Plasma concentrations came back largely below the assay's lower limit of quantification, so too low to detect. So a mucosal route at several hundred times the daily oral dose that clinics are using produced no measurable drug in the blood. For a gut target, that's not a problem. For a bum shoulder, it's the entire problem, which brings me back to the dose. Remember, clinics run oral 2 to 3 times higher than the subcutaneous shot. Nobody has published the pharmacokinetic work, the absorption, and the blood level data that would justify that multiplier, or any other one for that matter. My read is that it's a correction for an absorption problem nobody has measured, aimed at a target the drug probably won't reach. If you're taking BPC-157 orally for your gut, I think that's quite defensible. The route makes sense, the mechanism makes sense, but you should go in knowing the human evidence is thinner than the marketing might suggest. If you're taking it orally for a tendon, a shoulder, a knee, anything outside your digestive tract, I don't think it has a role. Not because I can prove it doesn't work, because there's no evidence it gets there. And the one piece of human data we have argues against systemic absorption, not for it. So you may be swallowing a capsule that never reaches the thing you're trying to fix. So if you're taking a capsule for a rotator cuff, I would honestly suggest stopping. And a quick note on BPC-157 nasal sprays too, by the way, since it gets marketed for neurologic indications. There is no human data of any kind for that route, and it carries the highest immunogenicity concern in the FDA's assessment. So let's take a moment to synthesize everything we've covered today into 3 actionable items. 1, if you're taking capsules for a joint or a tendon problem, reconsider. It might be the whole reason nothing's happening. 2, if you haven't started BPC-157 yet, pick one objective measure before you start and check it again at week 4. A pain score, degrees of motion across a joint, how long you can do something before it hurts or you have to stop, things like that. A number written down beats a memory every time. 3, if week 4 comes and goes and that number hasn't moved, stopping is a valid answer. Like so much of what we discussed, raising the dose is guessing at that point. Everything today was about what people take BPC-157 for and how it gets dosed. I haven't told you whether it's safe, and I think that's the bigger question for most of you. That's the next video. The side effect data, the interactions that actually matter, what I'd monitor, and the cancer question, which I'm going to navigate carefully because most people get it wrong and in both directions. If you want to talk more about peptides like BPC-157, or you have other complex health questions that aren't getting the attention they deserve, set up a free consult at barrickhealth.com. I appreciate you guys watching. Subscribe to stay in the know on peptides, GLP-1s, and longevity. Safety and the BPC-157 cancer question are next. See you then.